This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2018 annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. My guest today is a research fellow at Tel Aviv University's Tami Steinmetz Center for Peace Research and the author of a new book entitled But Abu Ibrahim Were Family. It was recently published by the Steinmetz Center. The book explores 4 different Israeli theater productions, all having a joint Jewish-Arab component of some sort over the course of the first decade of this century. And it reviews the stage as a stage for peace building. Dr. Lee Perlman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, Gilad.
So these 4 productions, was the joint Jewish-Arab element in them their raison d'etre, or were they just theatre productions that happened to have some sort of Jewish-Arab collaboration? I'm trying to understand whether they set out to become venues for peace building or it just happened this way.
Well, those are actually 2 separate questions. The first part of your question, did they have an intentional nature of an intentional group of Jewish and Arab-Palestinian theater artists? The answer was definitely yes. And I would widen your question to also include other members of the production teams, often the musical directors, the designers, the stage managers, and the tech crew in many of these productions also were both Jewish and Palestinian. So that's with regard to the first part of your question. I think, though, that none of them necessarily saw their productions as stages for peace building. I think they understood the significance of what they were doing in different terms, because fundamentally they were all professional artists who had one common interest: to put together a stellar production that would take the Israeli audiences by storm and provide them lots of work for an indefinite period of time.
But for you as an observer, how did the joint Jewish-Arab collaboration component, how did it crop up during the work, the pre-production and during the productions themselves that you observed?
So it cropped up all the time. It was the major element. And as I write about at length in the book, the Jewish-Arab relationship came up both in terms of individual relationships, in terms of the functional professional relationships, but also in many ways these productions and the rehearsal processes of these productions are what I call these artists waging the conflict, the national conflict between Jews and Palestinians in a non-violent fashion. There was conflict at the center that expressed itself in different ways in the respective productions all the time. Different artists react to it in different ways. Most in denial. We're artists, we're human beings, we're here, as I mentioned before, just to do the work, we're professionals.
Jews and Arabs alike? I would imagine that the Palestinians would be more prone to this kind of approach.
Again, artists who, even if they're schirim, as we'd say in Hebrew, salaried artists at a repertory theater, feel a kind of a vulnerable dependency on directors and artistic directors in big theaters. So generally in the research that involved the actors really directly opening up to me, and in the anthropological ethnographic research I conducted on the rehearsal processes of one of the plays, initially all of the actors were very hesitant to take a stand or express themselves. But in this specific production, 1001 Nights, the atmosphere around them in Jaffa, where all the activities took place, the fact that in that production there was actually an Arab director, Norman Issa, and I'll be speaking about this specific production here at the Israel Studies Conference as a case study for a tentative model for negotiation towards equality in the workplace, because you had a situation where with an Arab director and a combination of a majority of Arabic-speaking cast members, both the Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Arab Jews, the Jews of North African descent, who, if were not completely fluent, came from families from Morocco or Tunisia or Iraq or other countries where they had grown up with Arabic culture, Arabic language. So there was actually a majority, and as I describe it, an alliance of an Arab-speaking majority.
Yet the production itself was in Hebrew.
This production was in Hebrew, with a bit of an Arab language flavor of slang here and there, but with Arabic songs that all of the Arabic and Hebrew speaking or non-Arabic speaking actors alike learned fluently with the accents. They all learned to dance traditional Arabic folk dances that were part of this specific production. There was no conflict. That was about respecting Norman Issa's wishes as a director, respecting culture as such, in Arabic culture, but the conflict in that production, in rehearsals, was very, very cute around the bilingual nature, because the non-Arabic speaking actors were frustrated. Many of them were actors from the National Theater, the Habima Theater, because this was actually a co-production between a repertory theater, the Habima Theater, and the Arab Hebrew Theater of Jaffa, which today is called the Jaffa Theater. So this issue around the power relations and the language was very palpable in this rehearsal process. But that was not enough. Just a few days before opening night, the first IDF military incursion into Gaza took place, what was called in Israel Mifza Oferet Yitzukah, Operation Cast-Led, the end of December, early January of 2009. So in addition to all the conflicts around the language and political conversations in general, you had very, very difficult personal and emotional situations where partners of Jewish Israeli actresses were in Gaza, serving in their reserve duty in the IDF, and cousins and other relatives of the Palestinian director, actors, choreographer, musical director were in Gaza. And it was a very, very difficult situation with a lot of tension behind stage. And to add to all that, this was a play about the power of allegory and storytelling. What's 1001 Nights? It's about a cuckolded king who is wooed by the beautiful stories that ultimately prevent him from continuing to kill all the women in the kingdom. So very, very, the conflict was stronger than any declarative position of any actor.
Well, this is just an extreme case of, Operation Cast-Led, of the conflict really flaring up, but it is there all the time. Whatever you do within an exclusively Jewish-Israeli milieu, let alone a joint Jewish-Arab one. And much of the criticism that could be leveled at these productions, as can be and have been leveled at any sort of dialogue session, is that it replicates the power relations that are present in Israel, however you look at it, right? The fact that what you said about the language is a very good illustration of that, right? Even though many of the actors were proficient in Arabic to a certain extent, it was clear to them that the production itself would be in Hebrew, right? I mean, that is the language of the sphere they operate in.
Yes.
Does it not affect their interaction to a really debilitating extent?
Well, I definitely agree, and my research certainly bears out the validity of the accuracy of your question, or the assumption of your question, that yes, these productions, like any shared society or coexistence project, almost a priori replicate the power relations. And I detail that very much so in each of the case studies, on the one hand. But on the other hand, they're on different levels, and the example I just gave about the issue around language, which is a very palpable example, because yes, Hebrew theater, the Teatron Ivri, we have in Israel primarily Teatron Ivri, Hebrew theater for Hebrew-speaking audiences. And while there are more and more plays in Israel that have Arabic integrated into them, and not just these kinds of productions that I write about, Arabic is more present on the Hebrew-Israeli stage than it was certainly a decade or 2 decades ago. I would say that while the power relations are primarily replicated, in the processes and in the productions, I observed that the Palestinian actors had a certain sense of agency. They did not feel necessarily that they were a tool. I talk and write a lot about this notion of collaboration, or shituf pa'ula, which is a very loaded term in this neck of the world. Forget theater and forget the arts. Just in general, the idea that Arabs will cooperate or collaborate. In Hebrew, shituf pa'ula means both cooperate and collaborate. And collaboration here comes with it a whole set of understandings, primarily around Arabs who, since 1948, have cooperated or collaborated with Israel's security agencies. In Hebrew, the acronym is mashtap, mishatef pa'ula, collaborator. And in Arabic, amaleh, which means someone who is being communicating with. So I wouldn't, though, go so far to say that the replication of power relations is, in fact, debilitating. I would say that these are professional settings. People are working together.
But also, as you write in the book, much of this is being addressed openly and in a self-conscious way, with a great dose of irony sometimes. That helps, doesn't it?
It helps. In fact, one of the plays that I write about, and some additional productions since the research that I conducted, actually deal explicitly with the power relations themselves. One of the productions, in fact, the name of the book, But Abu Ibrahim Were Family, is from one of the plays called hummus, chips, or French fries for Americans, salat. And why But Abu Ibrahim Were Family? Because in the climactic confrontational scene of the play, the head of, or the owner of the Arab restaurant, or the hummusiyah, in the old festival of Akko, near the Akko Fringe Festival, the annual Israeli Fringe Festival, turns to the Jewish Israeli left-wing, posh Tel Aviv artistic director and says, "We're sick of you." And she turns to the Arab man and says, "But Abu Ibrahim, we're family." And Abu Ibrahim turns back to her and says, "You really think we're family?" And she says, "Yes, I think so." "You really think we're family?" "Yes, late at night when I think about it, I think we're family. So why didn't you invite me to your 40th birthday party?" And she thinks about it and she says, "Well, to my party I only invited friends." And this whole play was really about how within the Israeli theater world, the Jewish Israeli theater artists are completely self-involved with their own needs, with their own interests. They relate to the Arabs in a very instrumental fashion. Again, in this hummus chip salat play, there are a few plots within this play, and one of them, and the main one, is about an Arab actress who's not willing to say certain lines. There was the Jewish Israeli director from Tel Aviv wants her to say Catherine's closing monologue from Taming of the Shrew, because the play that he's come up with is a concept, a play called Taming of the Shrew in the Sector, or in the Arab sector. And she said, "I'm not going to say those lines. Those are lines that show a weak Arab woman, and I'm not willing to perpetuate these kinds of perceptions about Arab women." And the Jewish Israeli director turns to that character and says, "But you don't even sound like you're an Arab." And the Jewish Israeli artistic director reinforces that. "Your Hebrew is better than mine," etc. So there is an awareness and an expression in Hummus Chip Salat and in subsequent plays about this issue, because it's Arabs in Israel, and this is actually I know from my own professional experience and from other research, in many ways they're much more critical towards liberal and left-wing Jewish Israelis than they are to right-wing Jewish Israelis. They feel, and this comes out in Hummus Chip Salat, and it comes out in a lot of my own ethnographic research, they feel that Jewish Israelis are left-wing artists are ultimately really, really just thinking about themselves and aren't any better, in fact, are not as straightforward about...
Which is why these theater productions are so potent in becoming, inadvertently perhaps, platforms for peace building, because the demographic that is involved in them, both the actors themselves and the audience, I'm presuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, are these people who are upper middle class, who see themselves as liberal and left-leaning, but in fact are those people who are at the very center of the critique?
Very, very much so. So the audience that will come, let's say, to the Camry Theater, which is the Tel Aviv Municipal Theater, it's Israel's largest theater with the largest group of subscribers, performs most widely around Israel, would come to see a play, one of the plays that I write about in the book called Plunter, or Tangled, or Imbroglio, if you will, is another translation, a fancy translation for Plonter, which is actually a Yiddish term. In the first scene of the play, who do they meet? They meet a couple, a Jewish-Israeli couple that have invited over a young Arab couple, and the Arab man is a colleague of the Jewish-Israeli man, and the stereotypical way in which the Jewish couple relates to the young Arab couple, assuming that they'll only eat Arab food. They're shocked when they hear that the Arab woman is a vegetarian. They don't really even actually understand that they're citizens of the State of Israel. And we know that Palestinians constitute over 20% of the citizens of the State of Israel. And here in the first scene of this Plunter play about the conflict, the audience sees a reflection of themselves on stage. So yes, I think you're right. It comes back to your first question about these performances as peace building. And in the broader arts, culture, and conflict transformation field, some of my colleagues have actually come up with a topology, as we'd call it, of the different kinds of arts and peace building work. And the type that the work that I've researched fits into is called artist-based peace building. In other words, these are not projects per se. They're organic parts of the arts world where the fundamental impulse of this work is first and foremost the creative self-expression of the artist. That's why they're doing it first and foremost. They're professional. They want to express themselves. They do want to create bridges between them if we're talking about groups in conflict that are performing together. And this is as opposed to the two other types, which are community-based peace-building work and ritual or tradition-based peace-building work that uses arts and dance and music that is steeped in a given society or community's traditions, often as a way to heal. So these are three broad types. So my work fits in that larger categorization as
the
artist-based.
The artist-based, is it more modest in nature, in its perhaps presumption to instigate some sort of, a larger movement towards peace?
I would say so, because I think in general artists are skeptical to go beyond the fundamental role that theater fulfills in society, which is to pose questions. To go beyond the probing questions presupposes that there's an agenda. Now, this is not always the case, that many of these joint productions and these peace-building performances do raise explicit issues. One which I reference, but don't write about in detail in my book, is a play that's still performing at the Jaffa Theater in the old city of Jaffa called The Admission, a play by a highly respected Jewish-Israeli playwright Moti Lerner, where there they want the audiences to confront together with the actors the double narrative. Can we live with and come to grips with both the Zionist narrative about 1948 and the Palestinian narrative? And essentially he writes a Arthur Miller style, All My Sons family drama about how different understandings of 1948 rip both a Jewish-Israeli family apart and a Palestinian family apart. So sometimes the plays are more ambitious. They're not as modest as you suggest. But I think that fundamentally, especially if we think about the period of time in which these productions have been performed, these were all performed from the year 2000. And in October 2000, the Second Intifada began. So I often marveled when I entered into this whole research process. How is it? What is the glue that keeps these productions together? There's so much of this extra theatrical noise that is impacting, making it so difficult. And I discovered in the decade from 2000 over 40 professional productions, intentional Jewish-Palestinian professional productions where there was some degree of bilingualism or biculturalism. There was a definite awareness of finding a way to give expressions, cultural and political expressions.
So do you think that essentially every type of Jewish-Arab artistic encounter, whether they like it or not, can act as a platform for peace building? Is it really inherent in the dynamic of the encounter?
I think so, but harking back to one of your previous questions, if the initiator, which is invariably the case, is a Jewish Israeli, regardless of that individual or that institution's intentions, inevitably the art is going to be first and foremost about the Jewish Israelis sleeping better at night. I always remember a close colleague in Ramallah in work that I did in the Oslo period as part of the reach out to broader groups in Israeli society. And I had a colleague who was a lecturer at Birzeit University, a social psychologist, who said that the reason you Israelis want to meet with us is to sleep better at night. And the reason we meet with you is that you won't sleep better at night. So I think that impulse of the Jewish Israelis, who also usually are responsible for the administration of these theaters. They're, again, back to what you said before, Jewish Israeli, Hebrew theater, Teatron Ivri. If there's additional fundraising needed, it's usually coming from liberal Jewish individuals or funding groups. So they're serving their interests. They're serving their interests also to bolster their self-image. It doesn't make them any less legitimate, but it does reinforce this issue that they're first and foremost serving their needs and not necessarily the needs of the Arab participants. But on the other hand, as I've also tried to give you at least a small glimpse into, things happen. These dynamics happen. The actors and the Jewish Israeli directors and the crew members, they become families, you know. But Abu Ibrahim family is not just really, really clever, sardonic comment of that comes out in this hummus chip salad play. They do become artistic families. They do work together. They do show themselves in the audience that they can persevere, overcome with an economic interest. They want to keep working. They want a play that's going to run for at least a year or two, and if not 100 shows, at least 60, 70, or 80 shows. That's their parnassah. That's their, or certainly one of their sources of income. So there's very much a paradox here. Just like there's a paradox of collaboration, of artistic cooperation, which is so much a part of theater. On the other hand, this feeling of being a collaborator. It's the same around these issues of power relations. And
there's another element here that I'd like to raise now, which is the fact that two of those productions were produced by mainstream theaters, Habima and Nekameh, who are the two biggest theaters in Israel that are national institutions.
Yeah.
And the other two were more fringe or experimental theaters that normally push the boundaries much more than their more mainstream counterparts. How did this structural difference play out in the productions?
Well, there are a lot of different aspects to that. I'll point out two or three of them. One is that it didn't play out at all. That in fact, in the play in the Camry, which I referenced, the Plunter play, probably of all the work I've seen in the last 2 decades, there was never a play that brought in such a in-your-face, powerful, uncompromising way the pathologies, the social pathologies of both Israeli and Palestinian society in the wake of the Intifada, terror, the Israeli occupation. And this was on a main stage in Israel's biggest theater. And it was also a bilingual play. Some of the Jewish Israeli actors learned Arabic. They took part playing Palestinians in funeral scenes of Palestinians. Jews played Palestinians, Palestinian played Jews, Jewish nationalists, Jewish activists, settlers. So in one sense, there was really no difference. Each production had a different approach, sometimes a more narrative approach of interweaving stories or family stories that dealt with, like in the play Longings at the Jaffa Theater, which is still running. So in that sense, theater is theater, and it really depended on the artistic vision behind the specific project. On the other hand, unquestionably, in the large theaters, these kinds of productions served the leadership's real need to balance out the repertoire. Because the then artistic director of the Habima Theater, Ilan Ronen, and I remember in a specific interview, he said that for him, the National Theater was about all Israelis, and his take on the theater was its role in the civic sense, in the sense of really allowing all voices to be expressed. And he was definitely sincere. But because of the nature of how theater is funded, and for those of you who are listening who don't live in Israel, it's very important to point out that the funding model in Israel, or cultural policy in Israel, is a European model. It's not an American model, where theaters really have to fend for themselves and count mostly on just ticket sales and philanthropic dollars. Here, all the theaters, including the large repertory theaters, are publicly funded by the government of Israel, by the Ministry of Culture and Sport. They have core funding and additional funding that they'll often garner for a specific festival or for a specific project, and some will also receive money from the local government authorities. So it's a different model that necessitates the theaters playing by certain rules and creating productions that will be popular for all Israelis all around the country, and that will be bought by the regional theaters that are actually the largest subset of viewers in Israel. More theaters now viewed outside of Tel Aviv than in Tel Aviv, because so many regional theaters have come up.
That is an interesting question. Well, your study goes up 2010.
Yeah.
But right now we have a new culture minister who really revolutionized this, or tries to revolutionize the way the theaters are funded. And it will have, if it goes through, her revolution will have direct impact on this kind of, productions that don't really toe the government line. What she's trying to do really is defund theaters and theatrical productions who, in her view, defame Israel, or I don't know how she would like. I mean, this is really not in the book because it came only after 2015. But how do you think it will affect?
Well, first of all, you should know that this issue around the current culture minister is an issue that I'm very involved with, and also in a research capacity. And in fact, while I'm in town, I'm giving a talk about this very issue.
Brilliant.
To a private group that's expressed an interest to better understand how the arts are influenced by and influence politics and society and the actual implications. So it's something that I am involved with and given some thought. And briefly, what I'll explain to you.
Do you think it's just white noise, or is
it's not white noise at all? What I will say is the following. The current cultural minister, who's been in the position for 3 years, has become the poster child, the public face for a very real issue, which is, and it's her terminology, it's academic jargon, but it's terminology that she's adopted, the Ashkenazic hegemonic control of Israeli culture. And she's 100% right. Sociologists, including many attending this conference here in the University of California at Berkeley, have been writing for years, very accurately, about how, and I'll give it a little more substance, how the cultural policy in Israel has been completely focused on maintaining high culture, on making sure that we have a well-funded opera, that we have well-funded orchestras, public theaters, certainly museums and galleries. And North African Mizrahi culture, Ethiopian Israeli culture, Arab and Palestinian culture in Israel have been minimally funded. Another aspect which interests the culture minister is arts and culture that is developed in the West Bank, in the Jewish communities, the Jewish settlements, Judea and Samaria, whatever terminology that you want to use. And so she has actually taken this very real issue, which is, in my mind, indisputable. It's indisputable, this claim that she joins in on about the hegemonic control of the Ashkenazic elite around issues of Israeli culture, which I'll add is probably the last milieu in which the Jewish Israeli left-wing elites have still a very significant control, not just influence, but control as opposed to the media, as opposed to the army, as opposed to the education system. So it's really a cultural battlefield. She's taken this critique and basically brought it to a much, much bigger and operational level. She has taken, for example, a law that was legislated not by the current fourth Netanyahu government, but the previous Netanyahu government, the third Netanyahu government, the Nakba law, which basically enables the finance minister of Israel to either curtail or to limit funding for any public group, not just artistic, that expresses the notion that the 1948 was not a reason for celebration, but rather a reason for mourning. In other words, the notion of 1948 as a disaster, as the Palestinians, or most Palestinians experience. There's a law that was out there and that was upsetting to all sorts of individuals and groups, but nothing was done with it. She turned around, even though it wasn't under her auspices, and tried to have the funding of this very same theater we spoke about earlier, the Arab Hebrew Theater, now the Jaffa Theater, and have it limited. She even tried to...
But these are two separate issues, because the Ashkenazi dominance of the culture sphere, in a way, created some sort of space for the Palestinians to express themselves in their own terms. And the fact that she wants to take away that control from the Ashkenazis and give it to the oppressed minorities, she doesn't mean to give more funding to Arab Palestinians that, as you say, constitute more than 20% of...
Well, she says she does, and one might assume...
Does she say that on record?
She always, yes, she lists the Ethiopian Israelis, the North African Jewish Israelis, she doesn't call Palestinians
the Arabs
of Israel. But,
does she say?
But she does mention. The degree to which that she means it and will do anything about it is a different question. But you're absolutely right. And this last issue that we're talking about here really touches upon something that is a real troubling point, which is she, while using a very creative and clever terminology, what she calls the freedom of funding, chofesh hamimun, she states very clearly, I am not against and will never infringe upon the freedom of expression, chofesh bitui. But I do have the prerogative, in fact, the responsibility to enact chofesh mimun, freedom of funding. In other words, the prerogative of the government to decide what it's going to fund. And then she takes it to the next, in her mind, the next natural step, which is the government will not fund work or artistic institutions which host activities that she and her ilk perceive as anti-Israel or as threatening to Israel's very existence.
So if it's not just lip service, is it going to put a kibosh on the sort of initiatives that you covered in your book?
No. In fact, it's achieving the opposite. What's happened in the last 3 years since Minister Regev has taken on the position, and again, to add a dramatic dimension of irony, this has been, till this current government, the least in demand, the least popular ministerial position. No patronage, possibilities of offering jobs, as in pretty much every other ministry, relatively small budgets, little influence, low public profile, and you as a journalist know that Minister Regev, aside from Prime Minister Netanyahu, is the most highly visible politician and minister in Israel today. So she has not succeeded in squashing, certainly, the artistic activity. In fact, two things have happened. There is more and more of what I would call oppositional artistic activity that has gone on. There are many examples which we can't go into now, but there is really a sense among artists, and not only artists who self-define themselves as progressives or radical and such, but artists who really feel that they have a responsibility to use their art, to use their tools and their public standing to both create and express their views. And the other outcome of her policies is that there is much more of a sense of artists coming together to support each other. There have been a few other positions that she's taken that have prompted artists to take even bold positions where they've even given up certain funding in certain festivals in order to show solidarity with other artists whose work has not been performed. So there's definitely a different climate and a much more active and altruistic, less self-indulgent sense among more and more artists in Israel, which I find actually quite inspiring and very significant.
Well, I hope Minister Regev is not listening to us right now.
Actually, I hope she is.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Lee Perlman, Research Fellow at Tel Aviv University's Tami Steinmetz Center for Peace Research and the author of the recently published But Abu Ibrahim, We're Family. Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem and Julia Brahms, our producers. And now we have a small request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. Check out our archive with more than 450 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow me and my co-host Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.